Good morning. Oh God, I'm going to get killed by the press. There we are. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Simon Menendez, thank you for NDN in setting the stage for what I think is a critically important issue of American foreign policy, which is its relationship with the hemisphere and its neighbors to the south. And also, I'm extremely honored to share the podium today with my dear friend, Senator Bob Menendez, who is, I think, who has been a long-standing champion of deepening and widening relations between the United States and Latin America, and of setting inter-American relations on a qualitatively different stage for the future. So, Senator, it's an honor to be here with you today and share the rostrum. Let me start by my initial remarks by reminding those of you who followed Mexico for a long time. Last year was the 20th anniversary of the publication of what I think today is widely recognized as probably the most important book on the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship. It was written by a New York Times correspondent who spent many years in Mexico, and the correspondent was Alan Riding. He wrote a book called Distant Neighbors. And last year was the 20th anniversary of the publication of the book. And this book not only has, I think, defined sort of the scholarly threshold of the bilateral relationship, but I think also provides a nice plateau to try and understand 20 years after where Mexico and the United States are today. Are we still distant neighbors, or have we become something else? And obviously, the easy, safe, and kosher answer to that is, well, we're both. But I think that in many ways, Mexico and the United States have become strategic partners, but there are certainly other issues of the bilateral relationship where we still continue to be distant neighbors. First of all, unquestionably, many of us in this room understand or foresee the strategic nature of the relationship. Nobody articulated this as powerfully as President George W. Bush did when he went down to Mexico on his first trip as president in February of 2001 and said what no previous president in the United States had said about the relationship with Mexico. And he basically said, there is no more important relationship for the United States than its relationship with Mexico. Strategic rationale has been the midwife of the bilateral relationship. Of a Republican president in the late 80s, President George Bush 41, who decided to push forward NAFTA, and then also of a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, who inherited NAFTA from his predecessor, decided to put the political capital into the equation to push it forward, got the votes, and then a year later also invested political capital in putting forward a financial rescue package for Mexico after the devastating tequila crisis, so-called tequila crisis of 1994. So you've had both Republicans and Democrats with the ability to understand that there is a profound strategic nature in the relationship with Mexico. To many foreign observers, and I see several faces around the room who've heard me say this, so my apologies because you're fed up with me using this anecdote, but when I was chief of policy planning in the foreign ministry in Mexico, the then Israeli ambassador came in to see me. He had just arrived. He was new in town. As most ambassadors do when we arrive in a new city, we pick up the phones and start calling everyone and saying whether we can go in and say hello, and this Israeli ambassador did the same. And we started talking about, obviously, the Middle East and Mexican policy in that area of the world, and sooner or later we started talking about the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship. And he said, Mr. Sarukhan, I can't understand. I come to Mexico and I hear this ages-old phrase in Mexico that is sometimes attributed to one president in the 19th century or to another president in the 19th century that says, poor Mexico, so close to the United States and so far away from God. And the Israeli ambassador said, I can only retort by saying, poor Israel, so close to God and so far away from the United States. But there is obviously a strategic underpinning to the ambassador's understanding of the opportunities and challenges that a 3,000-kilometer, 2,000-mile border provides these two nations. Clearly, few countries on the face of the earth play such an important role to each other's well-being as Mexico and the United States. Given there are today more pressing geostrategic, geopolitical issues in which America is enmeshed. Certainly Iraq and the Middle East and Afghanistan, potentially North Korea, potentially Iran. But if you look at the day-to-day impact on the economic well-being, on the security of Americans, there is certainly no more important relationship than that bilateral relationship with Mexico. And after 9/11, what is very clear is that a threat to the security of the United States, or a perception of threat to the security of the United States, will have a profound impact on the bilateral agenda with Mexico. Witness what happened as a result of 9/11 and how the way Mexico and the United States had been talking about immigration reform fell off the sideline. As I mentioned at the beginning, and I'll try and be very brief because I know the Senator is hard-pressed and he has very important business today here in the Senate. But let me exemplify what I meant, that Mexico and the United States in many ways have become strategic partners, but are also distant neighbors. And let me use 3 or 4 examples. Where are we strategic partners? Clearly trade. Trade and NAFTA are a success story for Mexico, the United States, and Canada. Mexico has become the second largest trading partner to the United States. The economic growth that has happened in Mexico over the last 10 years, paired with macroeconomic stability and macroeconomic sound policies, have recreated a middle class in Mexico which was destroyed as a result of the recurring devaluations and busts that occurred in Mexico throughout the 70s and all the way to 1994. In fact, the other day I was in New York City and I was having breakfast with several prominent members of that sector of the American economy. And as we were discussing what was going on in the US economy, all I could think of in the back of my head is, thank God it wasn't us this time. But it's a really profound story of how Mexico has moved since 1994 to this day, and a great deal of this has to do with NAFTA. Even in critically important sectors of the Mexican economy, corn, for example, where we eliminated all tariffs, all remaining tariffs, in January of this year. When Mexico signed NAFTA in 1993, Mexico was producing 19 million tons per year of corn. Today, with NAFTA, we are producing 53 million tons of corn. So I say this because I do believe that certainly NAFTA has not been the panacea that some wanted to purport it was going to be. It still has to generate that trickle-down effect so that the breach between the haves and the have-nots diminishes. But clearly, NAFTA has shown that it can provide a rising tide for all 3 nations where all boats will be lifted. Where are we sort of in the middle with sort of one leg in the stirrup and one leg on the ground? Where are we sort of moving to becoming strategic partners, but we're not quite there yet? Counter-narcotics cooperation. If you look at the relationship 10 years ago when I was a junior officer here at the embassy dealing with the drugs and thugs portfolio, there was an excellent dialogue going on at the top between high-level government officials. But if you went down to the field, if you went into the trenches of the fight against drugs, there was such a huge distrust of agents on the field in Mexico and in the United States. Today, I was going to say the reverse is true. That is not the case. The dialogue continues to be excellent at the top, but there's been a profound change at the bottom. There's a degree of trust and synergy and cooperation and intelligence sharing which is taking place on the ground every single day between law enforcement agencies. And I think that we've been able to build upon this relationship over the past years. And the Mérida Initiative, which will hopefully soon start its travails through Congress, which the President presented for the approval of Congress in October of last year, seeks to enhance and deepen and widen the cooperation between Mexico and the United States as we fight drugs together, based on a fundamental principle which I think both countries now accept as the tenet of what we do in the fight against drugs: co-responsibility. That is, as Mexico seeks to deter the flow of drugs coming through Mexico into the United States, we need the support of the United States to shut down its side of the border to weapons, chemical precursors, and bulk cash, which are feeding into organized crime in Mexico. You need two to tango in life, and this is certainly one area where I think the United States and Mexico have finally understood, after many decades of finger pointing, that the only way we can win is if we work on this together. And this is what the MEDI initiative will try to achieve over the coming months and years. Where are we? Where are we still, obviously, far away from becoming strategic partners? And I will mention three challenges. One, how do we, in the context of what I just described, tackle what I think are the two main goals of our relationship: common prosperity and common security? How do we ensure that at the same time that we're bulletproofing our common border against the threat of potential terrorists or organized crime, we don't thicken the border so that the flow of goods, people, and services across that border allow North America to continue growing and to continue competing? And the conundrum of how to approach the challenges of common security and common prosperity will have to become a strategic driver in the bilateral relationship. I always use the example, there are many out there who would purport to say that Mexico is really not interested in the relationship with the United States in terms of security. And I would obviously disagree with this. Number one, because if there were ever to be a threat to the security of the United States materialize across that border from Mexico, the relationship as we have known it till this day is over. But second, because if you look at what we're actually already doing on the ground, the numbers will obviously prove that these theories are incorrect. Just look at trade flows. 70% of all US-Mexico bilateral trade crosses into Mexico and the United States by land. It crosses our land borders, 70% of our total trade. Of that 70%, 53% of that total is now coming in through what we call non-intrusive inspection mechanisms. That is, either customs personnel from the United States are inspecting the cargoes in site in Mexico, pre-certify them, and so once they hit the border, they've already been inspected and they move through. Or once they hit the border, they come in through these gamma ray systems, and the technical term is VACIS, V-A-C-I-S, but we call them gamma ray systems, which allow you to determine on-site, real-time, without opening the container, whether that container has bananas or has something else. And that volume that on every given day we inspect with these protocols along that border is equivalent to the total amount of exports that the UK, France, and Germany send to the United States every year. That's the amount of trade that Mexico and the United States are inspecting with this new security protocol every given day on that border. The second issue that I think has to become a driver for the US-Mexico relationship to become more strategic: labor mobility. And within labor mobility, how we deal with immigration. And again, as in drugs, we need two to tango. Mexico needs to do its job. We have to tackle the fact that previous Mexican governments were unable, unwilling, or incapable of generating the jobs that we need to anchor 300,000 men and women who cross this border every year because they are looking for a better paying job. Mexico cannot grow if we lose that human capital. In many ways, our loss is your gain. And Mexico needs to anchor these women and men if we are to grow at the rates that we need to grow to start bridging the economic asymmetry that exists today between Mexico and the United States. But at the same time, we need an immigration system on the US side of the border that makes sense. An immigration system which brings circularity back to the labor movement of people crossing the border. A system which brings out people from the shadows. A system which provides them with a legal, orderly way to come and go and find a job. Our ability to match labor and the market. At the end of the day, for Mexico, the end game has to be that every single Mexican that crosses the border into the United States does so legally. But we have to find a system where our people who are willing to come and find and search for jobs in the US market can do so in a legal, orderly, and transparent fashion. The third issue that I would like to underscore as one of the challenges we face in pushing this relationship forward is what I call stakeholdership. For many years, I think that we have been sleeping the sleep of the innocents, and the voices who would suggest that there isn't a partnership in North America which includes Mexico have gained ground. And we need to use the bully pulpit and the microphone to underscore to societies on both sides of the border, you've got loonies and we've got loonies. It's not an American exclusive trait. We have our own loonies too. But we have to underscore to our communities and to our societies on both sides of the border why this relationship is so important to the future well-being of both societies. If we are unable to prove and provide proof that a forward-looking, synergistic, modern, bilateral relationship between Mexico and the United States can deliver the goods on the table every night from the most humble shoe shiner in the Zócalo of Mexico City to the most important tycoon, we will have failed in making the case to why this bilateral relationship is so important to the future well-being of Mexicans and Americans alike. The challenge at the end of the day is whether Mexico and the United States are able and willing to play chess instead of checkers. Can we ensure that we continue being partners to success instead of failing as accomplices to failure? This is the ultimate question we need to address on both sides of the border. We need bold visions, we need statesmanship, and we need hard questions tackled head-on both sides of the border. Mexico is obviously willing to stand by its American partner and take this task head-on, and I know that the role and the vision and the commitment of individuals like Senator Menendez will help us bridge and take on some of these critically important questions that we face in the coming decade. Thank you.